drafted by Arab states, demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Czech Defense Minister Jana Černochová said the resolution failed to mention the killings and kidnappings of civilians committed by Hamas. Černochová said she was ashamed of the UN. She called it an organisation that cheers on terrorists and does not respect the fundamental right to self-defence. 14 other UN members also voted against the resolution. However, it passed the General Assembly on Friday with an overwhelming majority. The resolution was opposed by only 2 other EU members, Austria and Hungary. The United States, Israel, Paraguay and a group of Pacific Island states also opposed it. The Canadian amendment was defeated in an 88 to 55 vote, which have strongly condemned Hamas's atrocities and demanded an unconditional release of all hostages held by the terrorist group.
Have been speaking with regional leaders. This isn't just with the leadership in Israel, it's also the Palestinian Authority, and arguably more important, the many leaders of the Muslim world. So why talk with countries outside the scope of this conflict? Well, the reason's simple. This risks becoming another war of terrorism. It risks getting framed as a religious battle. The imagery of the brutality of Hamas terrorists is fanning the flames of anger. Many people want revenge. And on the other side, the counterattacks are being used to fan the flames of international terrorism yet again. Now, as this happens, I wanted to make clear the nature of the war on terror. As the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. So this begs the question, in the war on terrorism, who is the enemy? And in this war, what is their real target? What is the true nature actually want to achieve this enemy in the war of terror? Now, we're told the war on terror is about religion. We're told it's the continuation of the Crusades and the Islamic Jihad. We're told there are people who just plain old want to kill us because that's what their religion tells them. And that's the narrative, at least. But I want to raise some questions here. If the outrage in the Muslim world is really about the West killing Muslims, then why don't these same groups get infuriated by the Chinese Communist Party in its persecution of Muslim Uyghurs? Why aren't Harvard students out protesting to free Muslims from the Chinese Communist Party slave camps? Why isn't the movement of global jihad up in arms about the CCP harvesting organs from Muslims, just like the regime does to other religious believers? Why don't they seem to care about religious persecution in this case? Also, why is it that the countries making the most noise are also the ones working closest with the CCP? The leader of the Palestinian Authority met personally with CCP leader Xi Jinping just a few months before all this. Iran is one of the CCP's closest allies. And we know Iran is one of the world's biggest backers of terrorism, including with Hamas and with Hezbollah. Now, even going back in history, we know the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also in Palestine, was backed by both the CCP and the Soviet Union. And it raises a serious question. Is the outrage we're watching actually about religion? Well, look, given all of this, at the very least, it's fair to say that political interest seems to outweigh the ideological interest of the global terror movement. Here's another question. Why are most of the pro-Palestine and pro-Hamas rallies being organized by socialist groups? We've seen people hanging rainbow flags next to the Palestinian flags. We've watched videos of speeches where trans individuals are even openly supporting Hamas. Now, we're told the global war on terror, this whole movement, is about radical Islam, that it's about extreme fundamentalism. So why would people that would likely be thrown off buildings or killed in other terrible ways, if these movements actually did take power, be so keen on supporting them? In the United States, the pro-Palestine marches were organized by groups including the Democratic Socialists of America. The protests at the University of Washington, just as an example, they were organized by the Party of Socialism and Liberation Seattle, Resist Seattle, and many other groups along these lines. So if terrorism, including Islamic terrorism, is not actually about religion, then what is it about? If it's about politics, then what are the political goals? Or if it's about ideology, then what ideology is it actually trying to enact? Well, I'll tell you. Terrorism is a communist tool. The first terrorist movement took place in the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France. Terror tactics were used by nearly every single socialist regime in its takeover. The Red Flag revolutions of the 1800s were terrorist movements. The Bolsheviks in Russia were a terrorist organization. And Islamic terrorism also has these roots. It was created through a perverse reinterpretation of Islam in the 1950s and the 1960s by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a socialist movement that merged communist ideas into Islam. To explain this, let me start by showing you a video. This was a speech given at the time by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the second president of Egypt. He explains a meeting that he had with the Muslim Brotherhood in 1953.
وقابلت المرشد العام للإخوان المسلمين وقعد وطلب مطالب. طلب إيه؟ أول حاجة قال لي يجب أن تقيم الحجاب في مصر وتخلي كل واحدة تمشي في الشارع تلبس طرحة. كل واحدة تمشي. وانا قلت له يعني اذا الواحد قال هذا الكلام بيقولوا رجعنا لايام حاكم بامر الله اللي كان بيخلي الناس ما يمشيش بالنهار ويمشي بالليل. وانا في رايي ان كل واحد في بيته هو اللي ينفذ هذا الكلام.
Now, in that video, the president of Egypt and most people in the audience, you might notice, they're wearing Western suits. The concept of forcing women to wear hijabs is so outlandish that the audience bursts into laughter. Now, Nasser wasn't necessarily free from blame either. He plays a key role in all this as well. But we'll delve into that in a minute. First, let me show you something else. This is Iran in the 1970s. With the styles of dress, you could easily mistake some of these from being in California at the time. Women studied at the universities, they wore bikinis at the beaches. Some of these were taken just before the Islamic Revolution in 1979 that saw Ayatollah Khomeini come into power and forced a new system of extreme religious fundamentalism. Many people still like that. You'll still find modern cities in the West. A lot of them don't have the backwards look that's too often associated with Muslim countries. So how did Iran go from looking a little different from a Western country to where it is now with what we're told is extreme religious fundamentalism? Well, the religion didn't technically change. The politics changed. And that political change brings us back to the Muslim Brotherhood. With the global movements of communism in the West, we talk about Karl Marx. In the Muslim world, the man regarded as the equivalent of Karl Marx was Sayyid Qutb. And from him was born the modern authoritarian Islamist state. And from him as well emerged what we know today as Islamist terrorism. But for people who understand this system, they don't call it Islam. They call it Islamism. It's political Islam. It's Islamic socialism. Sayyid Qutb was a leading member of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s and 1960s. He was born in 1906. He studied socialism literature in the 1920s and 1930s. He studied abroad in the United States for a couple years in the late 1940s. And he joined the Muslim Brotherhood when he returned to Egypt. Now, his equivalents to the Communist Manifesto were two books. These were Milestones, and the other one was In the Shade of the Quran. According to the 2005 book, The Saudi Enigma, A History by Pascal Minaret, leftist Islamic scholar Ali al-Umayyad described the Muslim Brotherhood's new brand of Islam as one that concerns itself with communism, socialism, nationalism, liberalism, and all the currents from the West. What Qutb did was reinterpreted a few key elements of Islam through the lens of totalitarian socialism and violent communist revolution. These were the ideas of Jahiliyyah, Jihad, and Sharia. Now, Jahiliyyah refers to the idea of an ignorance of religious truth. Muslims use this to refer to society before the spread of Islam. But Qutb reinterpreted the meaning of this in order to push Muslims into violent struggle. He argued that all the world is under Jahiliyyah. It extended even to secular Islam, to any form of the religion that did not enforce the religion through the state. And he called on Muslims to die for this struggle, the jihad. Now, to make this jump, Qutb also had to pervert the concept of jihad. Now, the idea of jihad is taken these days as being synonymous with an external holy war, but the term just means to struggle or to fight. The idea used to be interpreted as a type of internal striving for self-perfection. There was a so-called defensive jihad. But Qutb expanded this into a concept of offensive jihad. And he targeted not just non-Muslims, but also Muslims as well. And he argued that any system, even under Muslim states, any system that did not follow his reinterpretation of this religion needed to be overthrown. And the idea of what that state would look like, well, that came through his perversion of the idea of Sharia.
From outside Russia, with Ukraine playing a direct and key role. Kiev said it had nothing to do with the unrest. At least 60 people have been arrested and more than 20 were injured after hundreds of men stormed the facility in the predominantly Muslim region of Dagestan.
The Kremlin has blamed the storming of an airport in southern Russia by an anti-Israeli mob on outside influence. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Monday that ill-wishers had used images of suffering in Gaza to inflame tensions in Russia's predominantly Muslim Dagestan region in the North Caucasus. Hundreds of protesters aimed to disrupt the arrival of a plane from Israel on Sunday, leading to dozens of arrests. 20 people were wounded at the airport before security forces contained the unrest, local authorities said. The passengers on the plane were safe, security forces told Reuters. The unrest followed several other anti-Israel incidents in recent days in Russia's North Caucasus region in response to Israel's war. In the wake of the attack, Russian police took control of the airport in regional capital Makhachkala. The Russian Aviation Authority then closed the facility, cancelling all flights until security checks have been completed. Regional leaders in two other areas of the Northern Caucasus called for calm. A similar appeal was issued by Dagestan's chief Muslim cleric, or Mufti, while Israel urged Russian authorities to protect Israelis and Jews in their jurisdictions, adding that the Israeli ambassador in Moscow was working with Russian authorities.
The Czech Republic's
religion to being an external system under him that forced people to conform through the powers of a totalitarian state. The Epoch Times explained this concept fairly deeply in the book The Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World. Qutb's system of Islamism was just a repackaged form of Marxism. The idea that the world as we know it is oppressive, that people are blind to this oppression, and that destroying this system is freeing people from this oppression, even if you have to kill them by the millions in the process. They justify the crimes and the suffering as being necessary to bring about their visions of utopia. In the same way, Qutb's basic theory is that the society of Jahiliyyah is being forced on people and has rendered them unfree. And violent jihad is then touted as the tool to liberate people from this. When Qutb's writings were first published, many Muslim leaders condemned his views as heresy. He was manipulating religion to build the form of a socialist government that he wanted. A Jamestown Foundation report in 2005 notes that many Muslim leaders felt that Qutb had gone too far, and his influential work milestones, they say, was denounced, both by the spiritual leader of the Ikhwan and by Al-Azhar University, which condemned the book as heretical. It was heresy. Now, in order to build this system of government, Qutb's teachings were taken as justification to kill. And this is regardless, again, of whether the people are Muslims or non-Muslims. Essentially, what Qutb did was just rewrite Islam into a socialist system of government. The identities of the state and the religion became meshed together. The result is that the socialist leader is then given absolute power over not just the society, but over the faith of the people as well. And because of that, criticizing the state is likewise treated as religious blasphemy. You can be killed for it. And he reinterpreted the ideas of violent revolution seen in nearly every other communist movement into being a type of religious war. Now, of course, Qutb's ideas were too extreme for most Muslims, and even too extreme for most other socialists. When the monarchy of Egypt under the pro-Western Muhammad Ali dynasty was overthrown in 1952 by the socialist-leaning Free Officers movement, Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood had played a key role. But after the revolution, Nasser, whose speech we showed earlier, decided to secularize Egypt, and he actually suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb was later imprisoned, and the Muslim Brotherhood actually tried to assassinate the Egyptian president. He actually wrote his books in prison, and he was hanged in 1966. Now, Qutb's death, meanwhile, put him and his ideas in the spotlight. The murderous elements of Qutb's teachings tend to be pinned on his later interpreter, and that was Abdullah Azzam, who said the death of, quote, pure innocent souls would be needed to bring about his system. Among Azzam's disciples was Osama bin Laden, the former head of Al-Qaeda. And it wasn't just bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that used his teachings. Qutb's concepts of Islamism and violent revolution are regarded as the doctrine of Islamic terrorism. And among the many groups that follow his teachings are ISIS, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Hamas. It was also Qutb's ideas that tied Islamist terrorism to the global communist movement. The history of this merging of the religion with socialism began taking root in the Cold War. It was a time that has odd similarities that we're now seeing taking place. At the time, the Soviet Union was backing the Arab world in attacks against Israel. From the 1960s onward, Palestinian terrorism has had strong support from the Chinese communist regime. Former Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat, who died in 2004, he visited China 14 times. He met with CCP leaders, including Mao Zedong and Jiang Zemin. The CCP offered Arafat's forces weapons, money, training, and guidance on strategy. The Soviets as well fostered the PLO, as was recalled by defector Ion Mihai Pacepa, former lieutenant general and acting chief of Communist Romania's Foreign Intelligence Service. In his article, Russian Footprints, Pacepa quoted the head of Soviet Foreign Intelligence, Alexander Sakharovsky. In today's world, when nuclear arms have made military force obsolete, terrorism should become our main weapon. Sakharovsky had a world map in his office, Pacepa said, covered in red flags, each representing an aircraft hijacking. Sakharovsky told him the tactic of hijacking aircraft was his own invention, according to Pacepa. The PLO was responsible for many of these hijackings, according to the specter of communism. The Romanian communist regime under Nicolae Ceausescu supplied the Palestinians with guns and ammo as well. The Czechoslovakian communist regime was supplying them with plastic explosives as the PLO carried out the hijackings and the bombings of commercial airlines. And none of this should come to any surprise. Terrorism has always been a tool of communism. In fact, it's one of the core tenets of communism. We can turn to Title 22 of the United States Code for the exact definition. It holds that the term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. For communists, these tactics go back to their beginnings with the French Revolution in the late 1700s. and the reign of terror under the Committee of Public Safety. It was the guillotine. It was the practice of sending peasants onto barges and then sinking them into frozen rivers. It was tying people together and shooting them with cannonballs with chains tied between them. It was the political violence of the Jacobins. And this same tool of political terror was carried on through the ideas of Gracchus Babeuf and directly into the teachings of Karl Marx in the ideas of violent revolution. It was the same ideas, even with the socialist and the anarchist terrorist attacks in the United States in the late 1800s, which culminated with the bombing in 1886. The chief of police at the time, Michael J. Schack, wrote his book, Anarchy and Anarchists, that the doctrine behind the killings in the United States was founded upon the teachings of Karl Marx and his disciples, and it aims directly at the complete destruction of all forms of government and religion. It offers no solution of the problems which will arise when society as we understand it shall disappear, but contents itself with declaring that the duty at hand is tearing down, that the work of building up must come later. Terrorism is a tool, not just for socialist revolution, not just for gaining power, but to also keep power afterwards. It aids in the tyrannical control of a society. Just A.M. Rouleau wrote in the 1949 book, Delusion and Mass Delusions, that man is weakened by fear, fright, and terror. He readily accepts any catchwords and opinions which promise security. He adds that the best examples are seen in small, isolated communities where a pathological fanatic, driven by exaggerated religious zeal, fascinates his fellow citizens and makes them fearful. He injects them with his delusions, as for instance in the perpetration of a sanctioned religious murder. And through this tool of fear and terror, he adds, the collective delusion finds fertile ground for growth. The population of the ship or the village follows the psychotic's contagious behavior and assimilates the same delusion. It's in this same way that Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks used terrorism as a means to seize and to hold power. In the same way that his Cheka secret police committed atrocities and they used torture and assassinations as tools. In the same way that, as we just watched with Hamas, Lenin's so-called Red Terror and the Cheka murdered men, women, children, and the elderly, and did so with extreme sadistic cruelty, where rape, skinning, and burning people alive were not uncommon. The Cheka later became the KGB, and it likewise backed and supported the same systems of communist terrorism, including with direct support for Islamist terrorism through the teachings of Qutb. It's because of this that the Soviets backed terrorist groups. It's why socialists and communists can preach the good of humanity while turning a blind eye to the tens of millions of people who have been killed in socialist purges over the last century. It's why the CCP today supports terrorist organizations. It's why global sponsors of terrorism like Iran and its many terror groups have no issue with the CCP persecuting Muslims. And it's why socialist groups, even right here in the United States, were celebrating the recent terrorist attacks in Israel. The key reason for all of this is this. All of these movements are just different variations of the same Marxist ideas. And terrorism is their tactic.
It is being accepted that this is happening.
Well, tonight in the Middle East, Israel is intensifying its ground and air assault on Gaza as the humanitarian situation becomes increasingly dire. This comes as Israel says even more hostages are being held by Hamas inside Gaza than previously thought. Fox News correspondent Trey Yanks has the latest.
That's right. The number of hostages has been updated to 239 people, according to the Israeli military. Today along the border, we watched as Israeli forces were operating inside the Gaza Strip. Take a look. As fighter jets roar overhead, you can see Israeli forces operating inside the Gaza Strip. The Israelis are working at this hour to soften their target from the ground and from the sky. The level of destruction inside Gaza is significant. The neighborhood behind me completely destroyed. You can see the mosques and buildings inside Gaza reduced to rubble as Israel continues their ground and air campaign against Hamas. The Israeli Air Force hit more than 450 targets over the past 24 hours. That number is expected to rise. The Israeli army also shelling the eastern side of the Gaza Strip with artillery units here along the border. And inside Gaza, new drone video showing the aftermath. Some neighborhoods completely destroyed in these Israeli strikes and shelling. We also know Palestinians went to a warehouse inside the Gaza Strip today that's run by the United Nations, raiding that warehouse, trying to get as much food and supplies as possible. It really illustrates the desperation for the more than 2 million Palestinians inside the Strip. You can hear that outgoing artillery fire as the southern front does remain active.
They didn't give the food out.
24 aid trucks made their way into Gaza today, according to the Palestinian Red Crescent. Some aid for the Palestinian people in the southern part of the Strip, but yet many more are in desperate need of supplies. Overnight, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this is a second war of independence for his country, adding, quote, "We will win." Along the Israel-Gaza border, Trey Yingst, Fox News.
Artillery Corps. Israel's military said it had struck more than 600 militant targets over the past few days. We are progressing gradually according to our operational plans. The offensive activity will continue and intensify according to the phases of the war and its goals. Meanwhile, thousands of Palestinians are taking shelter at the Al-Shifa hospital, the Gaza Strip's biggest medical center. Israel has accused Hamas of placing command centers and weaponry near hospitals, which the group denies. Israel has issued evacuation orders to the hospital, but civilians sheltering there say they are not planning on leaving. We want to die at Al-Shifa. Despite all the threats and difficulties, we won't leave Al-Shifa. Where should we go? It's all one death. We kneel only to God. Meanwhile, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly visited Abu Dhabi to discuss humanitarian aid for the people in Gaza with his counterpart. He said the UK is doubling its aid to Gaza, but its aid is stuck in Egypt.
We're working extensively with the Egyptians, with the Israelis and others to try and have a humanitarian pause, temporary pause, so that we can get that humanitarian aid to the people that need it.
Also on Monday in East Jerusalem, police said officers shot and neutralized a Palestinian suspect after he stabbed and critically wounded a border police officer at a petrol station. The National Security Minister urged Israeli residents to carry firearms, saying it has made it easier for some Israelis to obtain firearm licenses.